back. Wait, going live. Now we're live. Okay. So tonight I'm presenting on JavaScript Web Servers with Express.js. So just to give a quick background on the technology I'm presenting on tonight. So JavaScript became a really big deal in recent years because it's the only actual programming language that runs in a web browser. You have HTML and CSS, but those aren't programming languages. That's a markup language and a styling language. So because web browsers became such a big deal, the only programming language that runs in a web browser became a really big deal. So pretty much any big or major web development project needed to have JavaScript developers. But you couldn't write your server-side logic in JavaScript. You had to use PHP, which was mostly that was the most common one. You could use Python, Ruby, a bunch of other stuff, but you couldn't use JavaScript. So eventually, some people started trying to figure out a way to run JavaScript on a server. There were a handful of projects. The only one that comes to mind other than Node is Rhino.js. I don't know if anybody's familiar with that. That was an attempt to write server-side JavaScript, which didn't get any legs, obviously. I have no idea why. We could probably look into it. Anyways, eventually it came along Node.js. So if you go to nodejs.org, there's Node. I'm not going to cover how to install Node tonight, so it's pretty straightforward. They have installer wizards you can follow if you want. Most package managers have it, so even on OS or OS X, if you just have homebrew, you can do brew install Node. If you're on Ubuntu, apt-get install Node. It might be Node.js. There's a ton of different ways to install it, and it's pretty straightforward, so I'm not going to cover that. But Node is a platform that lets you run JavaScript code on your web server, and it gives you a ton of packages that work for web development programming. So let's do a quick glance at the docs. So these are all the different packages that are available. You have crypto, HTTP, HTTPS, access to file system, DNS, yeah, lots of different stuff. So Node is pretty awesome. On top of Node, because Node gave you the ability to create really simple, basic HTTP servers, and there's kind of a interesting point about Node that it's completely non-blocking. Everything is event-driven. So whereas PHP or Python or Rail or Ruby, sorry, the same thing, where all of those kind of, they handle concurrency more with threads. Node is completely event-driven, so it's a different programming paradigm. I don't want to get too caught up on the specifics of that tonight because that's not the point of my presentation. I'd love to talk about it, though, if you guys have any questions about that.
Some ways it's done right.
Yeah, absolutely. It leads to it leads to great performance. I mean, if you use Node for your server as opposed to something like Ruby or Python or whatever, you can usually end up using less servers to handle more traffic. So it handles concurrency in a much more efficient manner. Anyways, that's a completely side note. So you can write a web server in just Node without any extra packages or anything like that, but it'd be really, really cumbersome. So this guy, TJ Holowuk or something like that, he's made a whole bunch of really important Node modules. One of them is Express. So Express is a framework for Node. It's a web application framework. It gives you kind of a very basic DSL, domain-specific language for defining a web server. So it makes our job a lot easier for us. This is the absolute most basic Express app that you can create. Whoops. Whoops. There we go. So this is an example of how to acquire in a Node package. So we'll see that in just a second. We require Express in, we create an app out of that Express module, and that is our application. So then we can define routes like this. So we say, when our application gets a GET request to the root domain, this is how we want to handle that. The main components here are request and response. This is a staple of how all Node web servers work. There is a request object and a response object. The request object contains everything, every bit of information there was about the request that was made. So the path that the request was made to, any cookies that were passed along, any post data that was passed along, URL encoded, query parameters, whatever. All of it is in that object. The response object contains a bunch of different ways for you to respond to that request. So you can set the status code of your response on that response object. You can set the body of the response. Just anything that has to do with what your response is handled in this response object. And basically how Express works is it's just a bunch of middleware. So middleware is something you inject into a web application that intercepts a request. So it says, I'm going to grab this request before you pass it along to your main application logic and do some stuff to it. So middleware is pretty common in any web application framework or just web apps in general, whether you're on PHP, Ruby, Python, whatever. But it's all, I think, I don't have as much experience in those areas as I do with Node, but Node is pretty consistently defined with just middleware. It's always kind of the same logic where you have these functions that the first two parameters are always the request and the response. So you're able to pipe a request around by saying if it's this route, then I want it to pass through these functions. And that's essentially how you handle requests. So again, this is just defining a root route. So when this application is run and we make a request to just the root domain, we don't care what's in the request. We just go straight to the response and we said send this text. So this would just respond with the plain text of hello world. And that's all there is to it. So this kicks off our application with app.listen. So that just means to listen on port 3000. So this would run a very, very basic hello world application on port 3000.
Is that the default port?
I don't think it's a defined default port for Node, but it has just kind of been an adopted default for a lot of frameworks. Which, yeah, I mean, right.
Because it doesn't provide any
exactly
per se. So
right. You do see 3000 most commonly, but that was just kind of a community adopted standard. And I wouldn't even call it a standard. It really doesn't matter.
Right.
So, I mean, I'm pretty sure Rails default port is 3000 as well. I think maybe something like that, whatever. Who cares? It's Rails. Java. Just kidding, I'm sorry. Okay, so this is your simplest Express application. So let's see one that's a little bit more complicated. I didn't even go to my second slide. How terrible. All right.
Actually, could you open a few more tabs?
Yeah, hang on. There we go. Okay, much better. All right, so I'm going to pretend like I don't have Express installed real quick, and we're going to install Express. So just so I can show you guys, I did open a new tab, and that was the wrong. All right, so if we look at the guide, this talks about a couple different ways to get started with Express. It tells you you can make a directory, and then you can create a file in there called package.json, and you can plug this text in here and change it to your own project name, your own project description, yada yada. And in here it defines a dependency on Express. So this package.json is a way for Node to know what your project is all about. What's the name of it? What's its description? What version is it at? Should I show this on the public repository? So should people be able to install this for their own projects or not? And then the dependencies, that's kind of the important part. So we're going to see us include one more dependency on top of Express in my application. So we'll see how to automatically add that to this dependency list so that if any of you are familiar with Ruby, you have gem files. So that's just a way to list all of the packages you use in your Rails or Ruby project. Jeez, I need to stop that. And it lets you just basically, inside the project directory, run one command, bundle install, and it'll read that file and install all the dependencies listed in there for you. So that's the Ruby version of doing that. With Node, you have npm, which is Node Package Manager. And with this package.json file, it effectively does the same thing. It reads all the dependencies you have outlined here and makes sure they're installed. Now, I want to take a really quick note on why I like NPM and Node so much better than Python or Ruby or any of those. It installs all dependencies locally to the project folder. So you don't have to worry about global dependencies at all. And to me, that's just beautiful, because then your dependencies are, shipped with your project, and you don't have to worry about switching to different paths on your. I mean, it's beautiful and has saved me so much trouble. So, anyways, this is one way of getting started with an Express application. You can create this file manually, create your directory manually, and then you run npm install, which will read this dependencies block and know I need to install Express. And then if we did an npm ls, that shows what packages we have installed, what node packages we have installed for the project. So it's going to just show Express in this instance. And then we create our main application file, and we put in this code and a whole bunch of manual labor that we don't want to do. So I do have friends who prefer the manual way more than the automatic way, but for sake of time, we're going to watch the automated version. So there's also a package called the Express generator. Notice here, this is the command you use to install the Express generator on your system. Again, assuming you have Node installed already. Notice the -G flag. That means to install it globally, because by default it's local to a folder, and that's awesome. So this installs a global package so that you get this nice little command line executable called Express. So this is what the help page of that executable looks like. There's a few different options, but really not that many. Let's see. So this is an example of using that command, which is what we're going to do right now. In this example, he's passing the CSS flag. So if you use a different CSS preprocessor like Sass or Less or Stylus, you can say which one you want to use here. It doesn't really change a whole lot in the boilerplate code, so it's not something that's difficult to add on later. He's doing Stylus in this example. I'm going to do Less because I like it better. So let's say, let me bump that up. Okay, so we're going to install the Express generator, and it's probably going to say something like it's already installed, or it's just going to try and install it again. Either way. Okay, so now we've installed that, and I should be able to say Express, and I'm going to tell it I want to use the Less CSS preprocessor. If you don't care about a CSS preprocessor, you could just leave that whole part out. And then you give it the name of your application. So, my awesome app. I didn't tell you guys what we're building yet. Okay, so we can see the output from that, and it's telling you everything that it created. So if you guys have ever used Rails or any other kind of web application framework that involves generators, you may notice when you use that generator, it puts out a ton of files, lots and lots of stuff. I personally wouldn't even call Express a full-on framework. I'd call it a micro-framework. Again, if you're familiar with Ruby, I'm sorry I keep making these Ruby references, Sinatra is a micro-framework, as opposed to Rails, which is a full-fledged MVC framework. This doesn't impose any kind of structure on you. It's literally just a module you can include with some convenience functions. So it generates some files, but not a ton. Not a ton compared to a lot of frameworks, at least. So it tells us this is the next thing we need to do. We need to go into our directory and run npm install, because what it has done for us, before we actually do that, let's go in here and we'll look at the package.json. So you can see it's included a few more dependencies than just Express. And this is because we use the generator. And this is just kind of making some assumptions on what your web application will need, like a fab/fave icon. I don't think we ever took that poll. And Morgan and cookie and body parser, those are just modules for parsing out cookies in the request body, parsing out different types of data that might be in the body. Our debug, obviously, Jade is for templating. It's an alternative to HTML. And the Less middleware, because we told it we want to use the Less precompiler. So now that we're in here, if we just run npm install, it's going to read those dependencies and make sure we have all of those things there listed installed. And it shouldn't take long because I already have all that stuff installed. Cool. All right. So let's actually go back up really, really far. And the second thing it told us after we generated the app was to run the app, we do this right here. We set a debug environment variable. I haven't done a ton with debugging Express applications, at least through this debugger. Usually, I don't know. I'm a console debugger or output stuff to a file, and I know that may not be as efficient, but that's just my style. So give me a break. But this is how we start the application. And if we don't add the debug flag, it's basically just running this bin/www script. So that contains everything we need to boot up the Express app. So let's do that. Here we should add the debug flag. And there we go. Okay, so apparently if we don't pass the debug, it won't give our logs to standard out. So this tells us our Express server is listening on port 3000. So let's go to another new tab, because those ones are all occupied. And we'll go to localhost 3000. Welcome to Express. Revolutionary, I know. Yes.
Is that an H1?
Yeah. And an H3. All right, so just not super important, but you can see here, we see all the requests that were made in that particular request. So we had a get to root, it had a 200 response, it took 355 milliseconds to complete, and it was 170 bytes of data. And then we also got that style.css file, which was part of the HTML that was returned. So yeah.
Is this just the testing web server right now?
Yeah, and we don't even actually have environments defined at this point. That would be something you add on yourself. In which case, again, just stressing the point that Express is very minimal. It's a micro framework. It doesn't do a lot for you. But we're going to boot that up. Actually, real quick, let me see. This nodemon, yeah. Okay. So if we were to run this command and start our web server and then go change some code or whatever and want to see those changes, we'd have to quit this process and start it again, which just took me probably half a second, but I'm really lazy. So we're going to install this process called node, or this application or module called nodemon. And it is a node monitoring module. So we can pass it a node process, like our bin www, and it will automatically watch for file changes within our current directory. If any file changes, it'll restart the server for us. So hooray for automation. And then I'm pretty sure it's just nodemon bin www. There we go. So that tells us nodemon is running. It's watching this current directory. And if we want to just manually restart the server at any time, we just type rs, and boom, it's done. So we can just leave that running in the background and not worry about it anymore. So let's look at some actual code. So here's that directory structure that was created for us. Again, we have bin, which all it has is www. Public, these are our public assets. So JavaScript files, images, CSS files, any HTML that might need to be public is going to all go in here. Our routes, we'll worry about that in a couple seconds. Our views, these are our different views that we can load in our response. So based on whatever response, so just like we saw, we can have the get. Oh, I lost it. That's okay. So where we had just that absolute most basic Express application, where we had app.get and then root. In there, we can tell it to render a particular view, and we can tell it what view we want to render, and that is defined within these ones here. So we could say render index or render error, or we could create our own. We already talked about package.json. Node modules, just to point out, this is that local node modules directory where all the npm dependencies that we need to define for this project are installed at. This is that local directory where they're held. Our core application logic is in app.js, though. So this is the app.js file that is generated in our Express generator. So it's 60 lines long, which isn't a whole lot, which is nice. It starts with everything we're including. So this first block is basically just those dependencies that we saw listed in dependencies. So we have Express, we have Path, we have favicon, logger, cookie, and body parser. And those are just setting them up so we can use them later. Then we have our two routes definitions. And so this is including those two files that we had under routes, index and users. One thing to note is we don't include a .js extension here. You're in Node.js, it assumes the files you're including are JavaScript, otherwise it's not going to work. So, yeah. We then create our app by just running the Express executable. We require it up here. It requires it as a function, which returns an instance of an application. And then everything we do is now defined off of app, which is why you see app dot as the first thing in every single line following that. So the first thing we do is we set up our view engine. And so we tell it our views are going to be set to this particular folder. So Path is a module that's included with Node Core, and it's just a way to get paths and directories and files within your local file system. So we're saying to join our current directory name. This __ dir name is something provided in every Node application by default, and it just defaults to whatever your current running directory is. And then we say the views folder. If we decided we wanted to change this views folder to some other stuff, then in app.json, we would update this to some other stuff. So let's do that. NodeMon should say, hey, there was changes, we restarted, and let's make sure it still works. Okay, so that still works. So this is just to define your view directory. This defines our view engine. So again, I don't want to go into Jade or anything, but Jade is just basically an alternative to HTML. It lets you write HTML with a different syntax that a lot of people like more than writing a bunch of angle brackets, which totally makes sense. Exactly. So next, this is a bunch of middleware that we're defining. And again, Express is just all about middleware. Middleware, all the things. So the first one we do is favicon. This is just a little module that's basically going to be able to grab whatever favicon we have in our application structure, detect where it's at, and attach it with the request the way, or the response the way it needs to. So you don't have to worry so much about doing that manually. Then we set up our logger. Our logger is set up to dev. If you are running in a production environment, then the logger will be disabled. That's basically what this is saying. Then we use the body parser.json. So this is going to parse the entire request, or the body of the request for any JSON-looking data, and parse it, because when it comes in, it's just a big string. So it's going to parse it out as actual JSON and attach it back to the request body so that we can interact with it that way, instead of having to do a bunch of string parsing ourselves, which would be a pain. Pretty much the exact same thing for URL encoded, and then the same thing for cookies. So when it gets to this part, it's going to parse the body, or the request body, for any cookie data and attach it to a request.cookies object so that it's easier for us to get to. Next thing is our less middleware. So we're requiring it and automatically running it on our public directory. So this is basically just going to look throughout, or look recursively through our public directory for any .less files, and then automatically create a .css version of them. So there's not a whole lot of extra stuff going on there. You can configure this to, work a little bit more customized and maybe concatenate all of them into one output file, something like that. But by default, it just creates a .css counterpart of each one. Again, very minimal. We then set our static directory. So we're saying the static file should be served from /public. So if we get a request to any of those, to a path that starts at /public in our application, that's the directory it's going to look for that file in. The next thing we do is define our routes, and this is where we're going to actually get into the core of our application logic. So this is saying for all requests that come into root to just slash, so that means nothing additional on top of the top level domain, we want to pass all of those requests into this routes variable. And if we look back up here, routes is defined as the file under routes/index. So we can look at that file to see how they're handled. So routes, index.js, here we go. So the first two lines, our router, every instance of app, like we saw in the index.js file, or the app.js file, has a router attached to it. So we'd be able to say app.get and then this route. In a file like this, we already have the instance of our single app defined in app.js, so we don't want to create another one. All we want is a standalone instance of Express's router. So we're able to do that by requiring the Express package in this file and then saying the router should be an instance of express.router. So that just gives us a router standalone that we can then give back to our app.js, which is what we do right here. We're saying for all requests that come into root, we want to pass to this router, which that's what we do right here. This module.exports is what gets, this is what defines what gets included when we require this file in another script. So when we pull this file in up here, this routes variable becomes whatever we assign to module.exports. So that becomes this router object. So we say when we get a request for root, then we want to run this function on it. And again, this is just going back to that middleware thing where we have the request and the response objects. We could do some stuff with the request if we were actually curious. Go ahead.
Mind if I interject something?
No, go ahead.
I'm sure people have probably seen the arguments about CRUD versus REST versus whatever else. One handy thing about routes is when you stop and think about it, you realize CRUD, REST, it's all an arbitrary argument. You define your routes, it doesn't matter how you present yourself to the world. It's just attaching the front end to the back end. So as you're looking at routes, basically you get to disregard and ignore who knows how many flame wars that have occurred over the years.
Thank you for that. And I want to talk to you after this because I listened to a very interesting podcast about REST recently that I thought was intriguing. So yes, so his point is that with Express, it's awesome because you get to define your routes however the heck you want. You don't have to follow REST, you don't have to follow CRUD or whatever. You get to customize your API exactly how you want it to be customized. Anyways, so this route, all it's doing, it doesn't care about what's in the request. It just says, whatever it is, we want to send the response of this. And when we call response.render, that's going to automatically imply we want to render some kind of view file. So we give it a string, and this is going to define a view file that we have in our view folder. So it's going to look for index.whatever our template engine happens to be, which in this case it's Jade. And it's going to render that HTML to the user. Within that file, within that view file, we can also have template data. So let's look at it real quick. So if we look at, oh yeah, I changed it to some other stuff. So index.jade. We can look in here, and again, this is HTML. It's just an alternative syntax. And this pound with the curly brackets is going to grab a piece of data that was passed to it. So in this case, it's looking for a variable called title. So right here, we're saying the title should be Express. So it's just, this is a JavaScript object where we're giving a key value pair. It looks for the key title and grabs its value. So in this case, the value is Express. So when we look at this, it says, welcome to Express. Welcome to DevICT. So let's change that. And if NodeMon does its job, there we go. So that's an example of how you dynamically pass pieces of information, pieces of data to a view. For the remainder of my presentation, I'm not going to be using views, but I wanted to cover them because they are an important part. These days, I kind of just use servers for JSON APIs and then write some kind of client to connect to it, kind of disconnected from the API. So we're going to look at how to write a JSON API. Okay, so if we look back at routes, we also have users, but I don't want to mess with users, so we're just going to delete it. Actually, oh, that's all it is. Okay, we can deal with that. But we are going to rename it. So I haven't even talked about what I'm actually going to build here. So I'm building an application called Beer List. And I'm sure you all have been seeing me drink beer throughout this whole thing. I like beer and I like to try different beers. So maybe I need an app that keeps track of what beers I've tried. So that's what this is going to do. It's going to be a single user app that I can give a name of a beer to and it will keep track of it for me. So, we could have done the exact same thing and made a to-do list application, but I'm really tired of looking at to-do list applications. So instead, we're going to build Beer List.
You're about to be Beer List, the ones you need to try.
It's multi-purpose, all right? It's flexible is what it is. So we're going to rename this user file to beers. Okay. So before we move on, I need to make sure I update that here. So here where I'm including the file, I need to make sure I update that. I guess I could just do this. Beers. Okay. So, beers. So the first thing we want to do, well, we don't really have a model here. We're not connecting to any kind of database or anything like that. So we need to create a model. Again, this is something I don't want to go too deep into because it's not the point of my talk here, but I'm going to use MongoDB just because it's really quick and easy to get set up. I already have it installed. And the Node module for working with MongoDB within a Node application is called Mongoose. I know Jacob mentioned earlier the startupwichita.com project. We use MongoDB and Mongoose within that project. So if you're curious about getting your feet wet with that, that's a great place to do so. But this lets us define some models for MongoDB and lets us use them within our Node app. So first thing we need to do is to say npm install mongoose. But remember how we have that package.json file that has all our dependencies listed? It'd be great if that was listed in there. So if somebody else cloned this project, they could just do npm install and mongoose is already there. Well, if you put --save at the end of an npm install, it's going to write that package into your package.json file as a dependency, which is awesome. So let's install it. And whenever it's done, there it goes. Alright. In a second. Now, there we go. Okay. So now if we cat the package.json, we can see there's Mongoose, which is nice and handy. So now we have Mongoose. So again, Express doesn't imply any kind of MVC framework or any kind of architecture at all, really. So we've got to create a models folder ourselves, which is all right. So we're going to create a folder called models. And inside that, we're going to create a file called beer.js. So in this file, we're going to say var mongoose equals require mongoose. So this is our way of requiring a node package into our script. And now I'm going to cheat real quick so I don't take too much time guessing. Boom. Mongoose.model. Okay, so now we want to create our beer model. So we say var beer. This is going to represent our beer model with mongoose.model beer. And then I'm pretty sure we just pass it an object with key value pairs of attributes. So we just need a title, not a whole lot else to beer. We could hold a lot of other information about the beer, but for the sake of time, we're just going to hold a title.
90 shilling.
90 shilling. Well, we'll get to that part in a second. For now, it's just a string. Let me make sure. Okay. You know, I wish I had an answer to this. I think this is just a JavaScript string primitive, is what you're passing it, because MongoDB is a JavaScript syntax. But I always thought it was kind of weird that I gave it just capitalized string with no quotes around it. I'm assuming that means I'm giving it the JavaScript primitive of string, which is interesting. Anyways, so this is saying that this is going to be a string property. We could also give it integer, array, stuff like that. But that basically defines our model. But again, we need to include this model in other scripts, such as our beer routes file. So we have to tell it what we want to export. So module.export equals beer. We want to export this model that we just created. I'm going to do one more spot check, and we're good. Okay. So now we have our model. Let's get back to the core stuff. So if we get a request to just /beers, that should give us all of the beers that are saved in the database. So what we need to do is, first we need to require beer. So var beer equals require. We go up a directory into models and then beer. Did I capitalize that? I didn't. Okay. So now we have our beer model. So let's say beer dot find. Wait. There we go. Yep. So beer.find, and .find is a method that we could give a bunch of filter parameters to. So we could say where title equals whatever, limit 5. So we can filter our query within parameters of this function. But we just want everything. So we're going to say find everything and then execute this function. So this is a callback function to handle the execution of our query. The first parameter is error. This is kind of a node convention. The first parameter is always going to be error because that's the first thing. It's easiest to check the first parameter. At the start of this function, the first thing I'm going to do is say if there's an error, then I want to respond with a new error. Actually, yeah, we'll do it this way. Response.json. Actually, we'll do it this way. Return new error. We could handle this a few different ways. This just kind of depends on how you like to handle errors, to be honest. I'm trying to use the error object in JavaScript more. So we're going to say error finding beers. We could be more descriptive, but we're not going to. So if this is successful, null is going to get passed for the error parameter here. So if it's null, this won't run, everything's good. So if beers, and usually we can just assume that that's good, but it's nice to do a little checking. So if beers, we want to response.json beers. So remember how we had response.render? That's to actually render a view file. We don't care about views in this case. We just want to take our beers object and send it back in the response as JSON. So that's what we're doing here. We're taking the entire return beers object and responding with JSON. So let's open up another tab and go to Postman. Get beers. So here's that route we defined. Actually, it's not. Now we're on localhost. So localhost 3000/beers. Again, just to show you. There we go. So here we're saying app.use/beers, and then within our actual beers file, we just have slash. So when we do the app.use and then require this router in, that's kind of setting the base directory. So everything defined in this file, in our beers.js route file, is saying after /beers, then parse the rest of this route. So this is just for /beers. And if we do it, we forgot something. In app.js, we need to also require mongoose. And we need to tell it to connect to MongoDB localhost, what is that default port? 201227. We're going to check, but that's my guess. I don't even have to give it a port. Localhost/beer list. So we'll call this beer list 2. So that tells it when we start this application, the first thing we need to do is actually connect to this Mongo database. So we connect to the MongoDB, and from that point we should be good to go. So let's try that one more time, and we get an empty array in response. Makes sense because we haven't added any beers yet. So we need to add a beer. So let's define a route to add a beer. So we'll say router.post. So I don't want to go too deep into get/post and all that stuff, but there are different HTTP verbs. When you use post, you can actually attach some body or some data to the request body without putting it in the query parameters. So we're going to say when we post to root, we want to say dot create. I look this stuff up 1,000 times a day, I'm sorry. New beer, and then beer.save. Okay. So the beer we want to create is going to be a new beer. And the title we're going to get from the request.body.title. Again, if we look back at app.json or app.js, we have this JSON body parser and also the URL encoded body parser. These are the middleware that actually parse out this body along so that we can interact with it really easily, like so. So we're going to grab the title that's returned. An error. So we can test for that error and say if error here return new creating beer. If beer response.json beer. So if we successfully created the beer, then we'll just return the beer you just created in its JSON format from the database. So let's try that. We're going to create a beer. That. Okay, so let me say Odell 90 shilling. Do what? Title, right. Thank you. So we're going to send that, and there's our beer back. And we know it from the database because we didn't give it an underscore v property, and we didn't give it an ID property. So these are things that are assigned from Mongo database, which is great. Now if we go back to get beers, oops, save these, we will see that one returned. So that's great. So let's create another beer just so we can double check. Okay, created that beer. It returned just the single one. You go to get beers, and there's both of them.
I was saying your screencast just went to your image. Like,
Can you show me where you're storing those
What happened?
those again?